I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our program, Accelerated Approvals and the Pathway to Treatments. This afternoon, we will delve into expedited drug approvals and the role they can play in helping patients living with serious or life-threatening conditions. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Alzheimer's Association, for supporting today's conversations. Last year, the Food and Drug Administration approved 14 new drugs, including those for various types of cancer, kidney disease, diabetes, and Crohn's disease via an accelerated approval pathway. The program allows the FDA to approve drugs that treat serious conditions and which fill an unmet need in a shorter time frame than the regular approval process. The FDA's recent approval of an Alzheimer's drug has put the accelerated approval process in the spotlight. Critics are focusing on what they call safety risks, and advocates are focusing on patient access to promising experimental drugs. A few housekeeping notes before we begin the show. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillALZ. We are broadcasting live and will be taking your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video. Refreshing the page should, in most cases, fix the problem. My first guest brings both an in-depth knowledge of the topic and regulatory experience to our discussion today. Dr. Mark Mcclellan is founding director at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University. He is also a former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration and former administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That's quite a combination. Take a listen to our conversation. Dr. Mcclellan, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Bob, good to be with you.
Let me first start off with COVID-19. We're not back to having in-person events really yet. Last summer, a lot of people thought, well, we're going back to normal. We're not there yet. You've been a health leader for decades. Where are we in the battle against COVID-19? And are we going to get back to normal anytime soon?
Yeah, Bob, we're making a lot of progress. We actually had an in-person event last week that went well. Now, it wasn't the old normal. It's the new normal with attention to things like masking when you're in crowded indoor spaces together, air circulation. And the most important thing is we have a whole lot of tools that make COVID now different than it was in the past, not just the effective vaccines, but rapid diagnostic tests, treatments for people who are higher risk, and just a lot of knowledge about how we can prevent and contain spread. Unfortunately, the new Omicron variant's very contagious, very hard to prevent cases altogether, so it is likely to be with us. But I do think it is possible if we take the right steps on using all the tools that we have and making sure people are informed about things they can do to reduce their risk and the risk of people who can get COVID complications who are around them to get towards a new normal.
Let me shift to the FDA's big decision. It was a significant one. You used to head FDA as well as CMS, and those agencies had an interesting role on the whole issue of Aduhelm, Biogen's drug. What did you think of this, how the FDA and then CMS have pivoted on coverage, which is within their jurisdiction? How do you think that process worked, and did it work well?
Well, I think it could work better by thinking and planning ahead of time when we are seeing accelerated approvals or other FDA decisions that may have important issues related to coverage and payment. And this gets back to the fact, Bob, that FDA's approval standards for safety and effectiveness sound a lot like what CMS should be covering, but that coverage is based on a standard called reasonable and necessary. That's reasonable and necessary for the big diversity of Medicare beneficiaries. So what's important for reasonable and necessary? Well, safety and effectiveness certainly are, but CMS is also required to look at not the cost of the treatment, but whether the treatments are appropriate for the diversity of Medicare beneficiaries who live in very diverse circumstances, treated by healthcare systems with different capabilities, et cetera, and have a whole diversity of health risks and benefits themselves. So in the case of Aduhelm, the key points, I think, were number one, this is not just an accelerated approval marker that was used for the decision, but an accelerated approval marker, biomarker that hasn't been used before, and where the evidence, as CMS pointed out in the FDA review process, was a bit less clear and settled than the evidence on many other biomarkers that have been the basis for literally dozens of accelerated approvals in the past. None of those previous accelerated approvals triggered any real concerns on the CMS side for coverage because, as CMS clarified last week, those were well-established biomarkers. And CMS at a event that we had last week went out of their way to say, Lee Fleischer, who heads the coverage division there, to say that this was not a precedent that people should think is going to apply to accelerated approval drugs on a general basis, that for cancer drugs, for others where there is this clear pathway, people should not expect anything to be different. So why was this different? Well, very broad Medicare population with these questions about just how beneficial is the treatment, given what CMS viewed as more limited evidence on the biomarker, and also questions about safety. So there was some evidence of so-called ARIA, these abnormalities that develop in patients who are getting, and swelling that develop in patients who get these new treatments, and questions about what the consequences of those complications could be for the many types of Medicare beneficiaries who were not included, at least in any significant numbers in the trials, those with a lot of comorbid conditions, other chronic diseases, circulatory problems, et cetera. So that's what led to the CMS decision here to say, look, we want more evidence because it was approved under a biomarker that hasn't been as well validated, and because of these questions about the breadth of Medicare beneficiaries who may have different safety profiles and where the risk benefit may have been less clear. Now, people are going to debate that, but I think what people should also pay attention to, just a second important point here, is that the evidence base is going to change a lot in the space of Alzheimer's disease monoclonal antibody drugs over the next year. Bob, there are 3 other drugs that are in pivotal FDA clinical trials now that are expected to have results in the coming weeks and months, not just on the biomarker, but within the next year on actual clinical endpoints that FDA approved, demonstrating benefit in terms of slowing the progression of loss of cognitive function in Alzheimer's disease. And CMS, in its final decision recently, went out of its way to say, we're going to look at that evidence differently based on how strong it is on these drugs. So, not convinced on the biomarker, but looking forward to whether or not these drugs meet their endpoint. And CMS said they expect to see broader coverage if the evidence on the actual endpoints is meaningful. And again, that's going to happen within the next year. Mm-hmm. I would also add to that these drugs are going to provide a lot of new evidence relevant to just how good is this biomarker. So that might make CMS go back and look again at, are we going to get to the point where for Alzheimer's drugs, we can have a biomarker that leads to the same kind of accelerated approval path into coverage as we saw with cancer drugs and drugs for immune conditions and so forth, where again, CMS says, don't expect any new changes or new restrictions to emerge. And then one final point, I know I'm trying to cover a lot here, but this is an important set of issues, is that CMS did say they want more evidence on questions about safety and effectiveness and how the drug can be used in routine clinical practice in this broader, diverse range of Medicare beneficiaries who come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, who very often have some serious comorbid conditions, circulatory issues, others that might lead to potential bigger risks and new and additional management steps needed to use the drugs effectively. And a big question going forward is just how burdensome is that so-called coverage with evidence development going to be? is this a monitoring approach that can be set up in ways that are relatively easy for healthcare providers to participate in, or is it going to be a lot of burdensome data collection? And that's something where groups like the Alzheimer's Association, other clinical groups that have been involved in registries and tracking patients with Alzheimer's for a long time, hopefully can provide some clarity. How can that evidence be collected in a way that's minimally burdensome and leads to broader access? And wrapped up in that too is just one final issue that I'll mention, which is that because these drugs are relatively new and because the side effect profiles and how to manage them is not something that clinicians have routinely been dealing with, we have a learning curve for clinicians, geriatricians, others in this country who will be needed as Alzheimer's disease continues to evolve with better treatments, both pharmacologic treatments and non-pharmacologic treatments, where new skills are going to be needed. And I think there's more that CMS can do, not just to say, look, we want to make sure that the clinicians who are treating our beneficiaries can manage these side effects and can know what to look for and know how to interpret the scans and so forth, but also things that CMS could do to pay more for good systems of care for people with Alzheimer's. That's one of their major overall goals, is better coordinated and comprehensive care for all Medicare beneficiaries. That includes people with Alzheimer's who right now do not get very well coordinated care. There are these knowledge gaps as the evidence is changing on how Alzheimer's patients should be managed. And I hope that CMS can take some more positive steps there to make it easier for healthcare providers to do what's needed to create a good longitudinal comprehensive care approach for this condition. That is lacking for the vast majority of Alzheimer's patients today, even though we do see good examples around the country of how to do this.
And that leads into my next question about the stakeholder groups and patient groups and providers and industry coming up with a cure to this horrible disease. How do you think that process could, is a role for Congress here to codify some stuff? Well, what do you think, we've seen right to try legislation pass in recent years. So there's some frustration with the government process. Could there be more transparency? Do you think more dialogue? I mean, going forward the next 5-10 years, as we try to find a cure, what is key?
Well, I think I think a lot of people are hoping for rapid progress, and I'm one of them. What we typically see in diseases that are complex and maybe multifactorial, where the mechanisms are maybe not completely understood, but we're getting better and better. We're finding treatments that do seem to make some difference, is that this is an iterative process. So the first HIV drugs or the first cancer drugs are not nearly as good as the second, third, fourth generation. Often it takes more than one treatment or a combination of drugs and other interventions to really get a disease under control. I expect and hope that that's what we're going to start seeing here. And that means, number one, we need to have a clear pathway forward based on the evidence for what happens with coverage, what happens with post-market evidence for these treatments. There's so much to learn, Bob, after drugs are approved, because these are drugs that people are taking with the hope that they're going to have benefits, not next week so much, not next year even, but 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road. If we can intervene early with these diseases, and we're not well set up to do those long-term follow-up studies of patients. That gets back to the point I was making earlier. So what could Congress do to build on efforts that have already been underway to improve systems of real-world evidence, and to give, frankly, CMS more support to help plan for and set up these kinds of systems ahead of time? And do we want to think about maybe new ways of paying for these treatments that are tied to the outcomes they actually achieve over time, and that would really encourage the manufacturers to work with clinicians and patients groups together, not just to get the highest volume of treatment, but to get the treatments most effectively and equitably to the actual patients who would benefit. There are likely to be some big heterogeneities within the population of Alzheimer's patients in terms of how they respond to particular medications and certainly their side effect profiles. And so I think there's a lot that Congress could do to help encourage both the financial supports and the real world evidence systems, the longitudinal trial platform systems to take all of those steps. And then finally, one maybe simpler thing is that in this case and others, as Janet Woodcock said last week, this doesn't usually happen. Usually there's a pretty smooth process from FDA approval, including for most drugs that have expedited pathways into coverage and into use. But there are these cases for drugs, for devices sometimes where CMS has set up systems to get more evidence and get more confidence about how the drugs or the treatments can be used in practice. We're not always doing a great job at identifying those issues early. So I think helping CMS and FDA and industry and other stakeholder groups work together where questions about coverage or payment may be on the horizon to be able to anticipate those and maybe engage early in working through, okay, how do we address these challenges so that there isn't a big bump in the road or unexpected things that happen between when a drug is approved and when CMS makes coverage and payment decisions. Those gaps, those bumps, don't happen often, but I think some more resources to CMS to work with product developers, other stakeholders, and FDA to anticipate them so that there are no surprises down the road. I think that would be helpful for everybody. And I gotta say, Bob, it's really challenging at CMS now. I had the privilege of leading both FDA and CMS, and in the last 15 years, there have been a lot of additional resources devoted to supporting FDA, enhancing its scientific capabilities, having the resources to meet, probably 1,000 meetings a year with product developers and providing guidance and so forth and clarity about pathways. In contrast, at CMS, the resources available to interact with the key stakeholders about new technologies and the resources that CMS has to bring their expertise to bear and making sure there's clarity about what reasonable and necessary standards mean and how to make sure we're using these treatments as effectively as possible in the Medicare population. Those resources have gone way down. So much, it's a very big discrepancy, and just a few additional appropriations on the CMS side, I think, could go a long way towards clarifying and preventing some of these significant bumps in the road that arise rarely but are important, and we want to avoid them, especially with some of the really innovative technologies in the pipeline.
Well, FDA and CMS are going to be certainly busy going forward in both the approval and the payment reimbursement policy in the next several years and going forward. Dr. Mcclellan, someone who knows a lot about FDA and CMS, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you again.
It is now time for the sponsor perspective session of the program. We are joined by Kristen Clifford, Chief Program Officer of the Alzheimer's Association, in conversation with Joe Montminy, a patient advocate who also lives with Alzheimer's disease. And for the second part of our sponsor perspective, Dr. Maria Carrillo, the Chief Science Officer of the Alzheimer's Association, will be in conversation with Jason Jedlinski, publisher and General Manager of The Hill.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Joe. As you know, the FDA's accelerated approval pathway is a critical tool for bringing therapies to patients currently living with unmet medical need. As a person living with Alzheimer's, where treatments are just beginning to emerge, but the unmet need remains so vast, what does accelerated approval mean to you?
Thanks, Kristen. Accelerated approval gives people like me an opportunity to have timely access to new treatments. My disease is fatal. There are limited treatments, and no survivors. Researchers are struggling to find a cure. So having timely access to new treatments could mean, I remain independent longer. And that could mean I have more time with my family, which is especially important because I have two sons who are in their mid-20s. I could watch them get married and maybe even have children of their own. And that's something that I've long wanted to do. But I gave up hope on that once I got my diagnosis.
Thank you, Joe. So all of that being said, are you concerned about efforts that would potentially limit the FDA's ability to utilize the accelerated approval pathway or potentially undermine confidence in the pathway?
Actually, I would be concerned about decisions that are being made without hearing from individuals that are living with serious or fatal diseases like Alzheimer's disease. Our ability to decide what risk we're comfortable taking needs to be considered. There isn't a medication out there that doesn't have risk. And I think it's critically important for the over 6 million people like me. It's our only hope.
Hope is so crucial. In the coming months, as Congress considers changes to the accelerated approval pathway, what would you want them to hear from people living with unmet medical need?
I would want Congress to know what it feels like, to have a progressive fatal disease that has limited treatments. It's a scary place to be. And I'd like Congress to give me the same opportunities that accelerated approval has given individuals with cancer or HIV. I don't have the luxury of time. Accelerated approval gives people like me hope that I might retain my cognitive skills for a longer period of time, hope that it'll be a while until I need assistance, getting dressed or eating, and hope that I can live at my home with my family for as long as possible.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us today.
Well, we're thrilled to be joined today by the Alzheimer's Association's Dr. Maria Carrillo. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your support of this program.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much, Jason.
So Alzheimer's research has been in the news and drug development quite a bit recently. Can you start by bringing us up to speed and give us an overview of where that research stands today?
Well, I'll tell you, it is a very exciting and hopeful time right now, more than ever before, and certainly has its challenges, but I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Let's put it that way. It's such an exciting time. It is actually, for the first time, so meaningful for people living with dementia and their families. I'll start by saying that since the enactment of the National Alzheimer's Project Act in 2011, the Alzheimer's Association has actually worked with bipartisan congressional champions to increase federal funding more than 7-fold. That's been a key, I think, to keeping Alzheimer's at the forefront, not only in media, but also in the minds of researchers and bringing researchers into the field to help us accelerate progress. Annual funding in fiscal year 2022 for Alzheimer's research will be more than $3.4 billion, something many said could not be done. But during this same time, we at the Alzheimer's Association have expanded our international research grant program because we feel that this is important to fuel research progress at every stage across the globe, with advancing bold ideas and raising high impact projects that have huge potential for the field on a global scale. So add that to the FDA's accelerated approval of Aduhelm this past June, and we've really entered into a new era of Alzheimer's, not only detection, but also now treatment. And we all know this is not a cure. And this new drug is the first FDA approved drug shown to slow or at least slow clinical decline through the clearance of one of those defining brain changes in Alzheimer's disease, the amyloid plaques in the brain. And the decades of research has shown that this does have some impact on brain function. We also know that firsts are never perfect. They're never easy or, clean. They might be a little messy, but they're firsts. And that's really the hope that we have. There are many more treatments, not only in the anti-amyloid class of drugs, but even beyond in the pipeline. But in particular, for anti-amyloid treatments, it includes Eli Lilly treatment, donanemab. Eisai and Biogen have a collaboration for lecanemab. Roche is moving forward with gantenerumab's program, all of which received breakthrough designation by the FDA in 2021 to speed that development of these treatments. And that, again, should add to the hope for all of our families across the country.
It is certainly an exciting time for progress. Turning to the congressional side of this, the regulatory side, what do you think our lawmakers should prioritize as they look at making changes to the accelerated approval pathway that has been so key to encouraging scientific innovation and also preserving that for patients who are currently living with unmet needs with this disease?
Yeah, such an important issue before so many of us, even outside of Alzheimer's space. We do know that when Congress passed the initial law authorizing accelerated approval, and at every reauthorization, they've done what's right. They've reaffirmed this pathway, and the FDA has been very encouraged to utilize the pathway on behalf of patients. Lives have been saved, extended, and improved because of the pathway. On behalf of people living with Alzheimer's and other diseases, we want to make sure that Congress maintains and strengthens this accelerated approval pathway because we are one of those diseases with a critical unmet need.
And in what ways does limiting the FDA's ability to use that tool, the pathway and all that the promise it's shown, what consequences does that have for the patients that you see?
Yes, excellent question, because it's important for all of us to reset and understand that Alzheimer's is a fatal disease. There is no cure. Treatments are fairly limited and perhaps offer relief for a limited time. For those of us who have witnessed a loved one facing Alzheimer's disease and the consequences of this disease, they're all too real and devastating. I am one of those individuals with multiple family members. And this is really about preserving quality of life. It's about preserving time with loved ones during a time when it is most meaningful, right? Not necessarily the cancer model when it's extending life. So the accelerated approval pathway provides an opportunity for individuals with limited options to access those options. Those options may not be for everyone, but they should be available for those that it would benefit. And accelerated approval allows for that earlier approval of those drugs that treat those serious conditions that fill that unmet need. Alzheimer's is a fatal disease with no survivors currently. So new and better treatments, especially those that use novel mechanisms of action, are urgently needed for Alzheimer's and other dementia. Our families need them now.
You stress fatal disease, and that brings to mind the way HIV in the not too distant past went from a death sentence to a chronic disease that can be managed, and in large part because of accelerated approval pipelines. So treatments for cancer and rare diseases are emerging through that same pathway. I guess, what are you looking for as you speak to our lawmakers about continuing to offer that same hope to patients living with Alzheimer's?
Well, exactly. Thanks to that accelerated approval pathway, we have seen tremendous progress in treatment for other diseases. And these accelerated approvals have meant so much to many individuals that are dealing with facing tough and fatal diagnoses. Congress has the ability to continue this progress and give people hope. It's important for Congress not to lose sight of that patient, of their perspective, their family's perspective, their tolerance for risk, and what treatments are approved through that accelerated approval and what it might mean for them and their families.
If you think of the changes that you would like to see to the pathway as you advocate for families and medical professionals, what are a couple examples of changes that you'd hope to see?
Well, I think it is very important that as we evolve as a new treatment era, real world clinical outcomes have to be collected. We recognize that. They have to be analyzed and shared with practitioners, with clinical researchers and others, especially for those who are treating patients every day, so that we can be responsive in real time to the changes and needs that might come as a result of experiencing these new treatments in real time in the clinic. That's exciting. It's an exciting place to be, even though we recognize we have to deal with these challenges. The Alzheimer's Association is very supportive of updates to the accelerated approval pathway that expands acceptable real-world evidence that can be used, gathered to fulfill post-approval, full approval study requirements, to confirm the predicted clinical outcomes and of benefit that we all are looking for, of course. So specifically, we support evidence based on the analysis of data in clinical care, data repositories, patient registries, and other sources for real-world evidence. We also believe the registry-based studies of large numbers of participants is a viable option to secure data and evidence to address potential effectiveness in the long term. We know this might not be possible in the short term, depending on the type of registry and patient support. But this past October, the Alzheimer's Association and other partners actually announced that we ourselves were launching the National Treatment and Diagnostic Alzheimer's Registry. We're calling it ALZNet. And this registry does aim to monitor and report clinical safety endpoints for patients treated with any novel FDA-approved therapy, including their accompanying diagnostics, because we understand that this landscape is very complicated with these first class of treatments that are coming through the pipeline. And we need those real-world setting examples. Similar successful registries have been launched, so we know this can be done. This is done in heart, in cancer, and multiple sclerosis, et cetera. And so we can do this. We need to do this. And so we ask Congress, of course, to support the use of these types of pathways to address these unmet needs, but to also support the ability for us to gather that real world evidence. And so we appreciate that Congress is looking at the accelerated approval pathway and that any policy should be evaluated through this lens. And we also encourage that we think that Congress should encourage FDA to use internal and external expertise in understanding the latest of science and to use that latest science to support accelerated approval.
More evidence, more data, better outcomes, better decisions. It's a very compelling argument. Thank you again so much, Dr. Maria Carrillo, Chief Science Officer for the Alzheimer's Association. Thank you for being with us, and we appreciate your support.
Thank you. It's great to be a part of this critical discussion.
Thanks again to Dr. Maria Carrillo and the Alzheimer's Association for supporting today's important conversations. I'm now joined by Congressman Brad Wenstrup, a Republican from Ohio. He's a member of the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Health and also serves as co-chair of the GOP Doctors Caucus, and Alzheimer's is an important legislative priority. Welcome, Congressman.
Pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad I got to hear the good doctor right before me and all the things that she was espousing. I have to say I'm in agreement with her. And I'm in agreement with her, too, on some of the things that she said where Congress doesn't always get it. But we do have enough physicians here on both sides of the aisle that a lot of times we can get our voice heard and try and explain it to our colleagues in Congress.
You know, Congressman, this is all about saving lives and the quality of life. And, you know, we've talked about today a lot of acronyms and innovation, FDA, CMS, and the gears of government. But from a 30,000-foot perspective, where do you think policymakers have made some progress in the fight against Alzheimer's, and where do policymakers need to go?
Well, Alzheimer's and really there's other things like ALS and other diseases and pathologies that exist that I think we're starting to make a difference. In other words, our healthcare system has so much been involved. If you break it, we'll fix it. And yeah, we're pretty good with treatments and innovations and extending life. But how can we improve life? In other words, lifespan as opposed or health span as opposed to lifespan. So how do we keep people healthier longer? And so this message, I think, is getting through to a lot of people across the country. And so Alzheimer's fits right into that, right? If we can find a way to prevent or to slow this disease down and to make people's quality of life better. And you know, this is one of those diseases too, where it's not just the person who gets Alzheimer's that's affected, it's the entire family. It's those that have to quit their job to take care of their loved one because of this decline. And so those types of things are being considered. So what can we do to prevent? You know, a lot of times in Washington, it all comes down to dollars for too many people, and they're not thinking of the lives involved and the human beings involved. But you can even talk about the dollars, because if you can prevent something like Alzheimer's or delay it for years and years, the savings will be tremendous in our total healthcare system. You know, you just look at what we spend per person on Alzheimer's today. Why not take some of that and put it in towards prevention? And so I do get concerned. We definitely want the accelerated pathway to continue and to drive on. We want to get cures to people faster. And we want people to have a higher quality of life and access and affordability. I do get concerned when I see where FDA approves a drug for Alzheimer's and then CMS says, well, we're not going to pay for it. And then going forward, the only way you can get some of these new emerging medications is if you're in a trial. I think that's a problem for us, and I think we have to dig into that as members of Congress.
And what do you think, Congressman, is the answer to that, where you have this disconnect, seemingly, from FDA and CMS, have different jurisdictions, but this has been a weird kind of break between the two agencies?
Yeah, it really is, and not one that you very often see, fortunately, but we're definitely seeing it here. You know, from where I sit, I would like to sit down with the both entities and really discuss. Well, FDA approved it, says it's safe and effective. They did their job. The drug has been through trials, and the science seems to be logical. You're trying to diminish the amyloid production, which seems to be one of the major causes of the eventual dementia. And then ask CMS why it is you would block this. And are they actually looking at the potential savings over 20 years? If it's all about money, are they looking at the savings over 20 years if you can actually prevent someone from needing all the care that goes with Alzheimer's? Look, as doctors said before, we've all seen it in our families. As a physician practicing for over 26 years in private practice, I saw patients decline. I've seen it within my family. And you know, it's obvious when it's starting. Well, the earlier you can check it, find the markers that tell us it may happen, then we can get out there and try to be ahead of this. And I think we need to continue to go in that direction for the good of those that are looking for hope, and for those of us that want to provide hope and to provide care for people. Prevention is phenomenal, and if we can do that, then the next step will be even better, as typically happens in medicine. You get one new drug, you get one new technology, it leads to getting better and better and better. We've always seen that in medicine. Why we don't want to hold this up.
Congressman, we now have an audience question from Paul Kelly. I do want to point out that this question is about legislation, so we thought it would be best directed at you if we can roll the video of Paul asking his question.
Cures 2.0. A bipartisan bill that was introduced earlier this year by Congresswoman Diana DeGette and Congressman Fred Upton, bipartisan legislation to address medical innovation and speed the development of new medicines. I'm wondering if the panelists think there's sufficient authority in the government to do that already, or whether they think that bill is necessary, and what they might think the prospects are for that legislation in this Congress. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate the question. I serve on Ways and Means Committee, and I'm on the Health Subcommittee. I am co-chair of our Doctors Caucus that we have here. And we also have on Ways and Means Committee, Rural and Underserved Healthcare Task Force. One of the things we are trying to drive are policies that goes right in sync with that we can get more cures out faster, get rid of the roadblocks, create more access, cut out the bureaucracy, cut out the red tape. We want to be safe. We understand that. Look, I think Operation Warp Speed was an example of how we can get things done in a timely fashion if we eliminate some of the not necessarily the red tape, but speed up the process. So all of these things go hand in hand with what we're trying to accomplish. And hopefully we can get enough of our colleagues to understand that we can have safety and we can have rapid development. And we have to make it where it's not impossible. And if you think you're going to innovate and create a new drug, but no one's going to let it come to market, or if you think that you can do all this and then not be reimbursed for it in some way, there's that fine line we have to walk. You know, we have to be working together on all fronts, and I think that more of that attitude is coming forward in Congress. At least I hope it is, that we can go in that direction. But we're crafting policy exactly in that line today, and we want to hear from stakeholders. We want to hear from people that are out there that are going through waiting for a medication. We want to hear from those that are making new medications. What are the roadblocks? How can we try and improve that and incorporate that into our policy?
Last question, Congressman. As you know, there's a big election coming up in the fall, and the House Democratic majority is very, very slim. A lot of handicappers, independents, say, listen, you look at history, you look at the president's approval process, the House is likely to flip. On healthcare for the Ways and Means Committee, what would that mean as far as a new direction in policy?
Well, I think you'll see a lot of things come forward that I think will get some bipartisan support on. You'd be surprised how many things we do get bipartisan support on Ways and Means Committee. But on the Republican side, we have multiple task forces that we are working on right now so that we have our policies ready to roll out even before an election, but certainly after the election. And so these task forces, we're working on things. I'm on the Healthy Futures Task Force, and I'm chairing the subcommittee on treatments. And again, it comes to accelerating innovation, not stymieing innovation, increasing access and availability and affordability for patients. All of those things have to come together. We want to get care to every American that we possibly can. And we, like I was saying before, improve their quality of life. So I think that's the direction that we're going in. Those are the policies that we're putting together, and we'll be making more of those public in the very near future, actually.
Congressman Winstrup, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, very powerful committee, and co-chair of the GOP Doctors Caucus. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Well, last year, the FDA's accelerated approval pathway fast-tracked drugs targeting cancer, type 2 diabetes, and rare diseases. How are patient groups responding to the current discussion surrounding accelerated approvals? Well, let's find out. Cynthia Rice is Chief Mission Strategy Officer at JDRF, a type 1 diabetes patient advocacy group. Neil Thacker is Chief Mission Officer at the ALS Association. ALS is also called Lou Gehrig's disease. And Jamie Sullivan is Senior Director for Policy at Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. Thank you for joining us. Cynthia, I want to start with you. The mission of your group, JDRF, is to accelerate life-changing breakthroughs. What progress have we made in recent years, and what progress do we need to make in the coming years?
Well, thanks to significant investment from both the public and the private sector over several decades, we now have multiple human clinical trials for better treatments as well as cures for type 1 diabetes. And many of those are in regulatory review. We've also had tremendous progress in the last decade in better technologies to help people live better with the disease. But our ultimate goal is cures, and that involves moving things forward from early stage discovery to translational research into human clinical trials and through the regulatory and reimbursement processes.
Neil, going to you, the FDA recently has delved into a new treatment for ALS, and ALS is just a devastating disease. I've known a couple people recently who passed away, including former Congressman Walter Jones, who I knew well from ALS. What did you think of the FDA's recommendation, and where do you think they should go from here as far as new breakthrough therapies?
You mean the recommendation on the new ALS drug?
Yes.
Well, so the FDA recently had an advisory committee meeting, and that, of course, isn't binding. That's advisory to the FDA. And it was really interesting. This drug is showing a lot of promise. I think the community is very excited about it. It's the first new treatment that's coming from the Ice Bucket Challenge investments that were made into new research. And so it's the first drug we're seeing in a long time that's showing actual evidence of clinical improvement, not improvement, but slowing of progression, and also an increase in length of life. What the committee, though, was asked a really interesting question, where it was really asking them to have certainty. Do the data from this single randomized controlled trial and the open label extension establish conclusion that this drug is effective in the treatment of patients with ALS? And you have to remember the context of ALS. It's a rare disease. It moves very, very quickly. People only have a few years to live, and it's fatal. And so certainty in a rare disease means that you have to run many more years of trials, most likely. And that's the way the committee found. They voted, it was a mixed vote, but they reluctantly decided not to recommend under that question. But that's not the question. The question that an ALS clinician faces is, do we know enough about the safety and efficacy of this drug to make it a treatment option for physicians who care for people with ALS? That's a different question, and it gets to the role of the FDA. The role of the FDA is to advance the health of the American people. And maybe they asked the wrong question, but it's just a recommendation, so they still have the chance, I think, to approve this drug and make it available to people with ALS.
A quick follow-up on that, Neil. Many years ago, when I covered healthcare, ALS was added to Medicare coverage by Congress in 2001. That was a very powerful lobbying effort at the time. It wasn't easy back then. But because of the Medicare, we've been talking all day about FDA's role and CMS's role. Because you have to get a drug approved, and if it's very expensive, and usually they are in the beginning, certainly, you've got to get it paid for. How is the role between FDA and CMS? Could you see improvements there? Do you think the process is working as designed?
Well, it's strange, right? They're supposed to be separate, but I think the expectation that everyone has is that once FDA approves a drug, people are going to be able to access it. And I think a very disturbing trend that not just within CMS, but outside of CMS is we're trying to control the price of drugs by limiting access to those drugs. And that's just not a great approach. If we have a drug and we think it has benefit, then a doctor and a patient should be able to work those things out together, and those drugs should be affordable and accessible. And especially when we've identified systemic bias all throughout our health system, to have different kinds of barriers to getting a drug, who's going to be affected most? It's the people who aren't well served in our health system in general. And so this is, I think, a disturbing trend. Hopefully CMS and FDA can align, but that's just, I think, one example of the challenges of getting access to a medication. I'm sure you've experienced, I'm sure everyone has experienced this sort of triangle we get between our payer and our pharmacist and our doctor, where everyone is saying, we just need one more decision or one more piece of paper from the other person before you get your medication, and we just need our medication. And for people like me, it's annoying. But if you have a serious illness where you have trouble communicating or moving around, and you can't just drive to the drugstore and wait in line and work it through, these are pretty serious concerns.
Jamie, when we're talking about rare diseases, when you use the word rare, there are many rare diseases, but as far as people getting rare diseases, not so rare. I believe the stats are 1 in 10 have a rare disease. How do you think the process is in this country of, number one, the accelerated pathway process? How could that be strengthened? And how could the overall process be strengthened of government policymakers, Congress, so that patients can get the treatment that they need, even if they are not perfect and, of course, are going to be controversial at first?
Sure. Well, thanks. So I think that first and foremost, we know that based on how the accelerated approval pathway has transformed outcomes in HIV/AIDS and cancer care, that it's working as intended, as Congress intended. And that reforms really should unleash that potential to help those with the unmet need with serious illness. And we know that rare diseases are that. We know 95% of rare diseases, there's about 7,000 to 10,000 of them, don't have any approved treatments. And we need to get options and hope to those patients as soon as possible. So we have, really been working on developing some accelerated approval related solutions, but also on, as you mentioned, on the process overall. And I think it's important just to note that therapies for rare diseases are really developed for complex populations. There's no one size fits all solution, and that the standards of of approval are going to be really have to take into account the population that they're being developed for. And ultimately, we have been thinking through reforms to the accelerated approval that will support the prioritization and resources that are necessary to better understand rare disease endpoints. If you look at the therapies approved in cancer using accelerated approval, there's about 2 biomarkers that are used, and those are very well understood. Why we're not having this conversation about some of the accelerated approvals in oncology is that the payers understand those biomarkers. They understand what they mean, the science behind them. And in rare disease, that's not necessarily the case. So let's invest now in that evidence generation, in that better understanding of biomarkers to help improve the process overall. We know that we can strengthen the confirmatory trial process through more frequent engagement with the agency, through better use of tools like real-world evidence, which you've heard today. And that we know we can still protect the statutory roles of the agencies, of FDA, of CMS, while facilitating earlier and more frequent engagement. So those are just a few of the ways we think we can move forward. We know that we need to strengthen the coordination and collaboration within the FDA on rare disease issues across divisions, across centers, and we need to make sure that the FDA is bringing in the right expertise, the right rare disease experts into the process as well.
And continuing the interactive theme, we do have another question from someone watching, and this one comes from Jessica Nickran, and this can really be answered by anybody or multiple people. Let's have a listen.
Hi, my name is Jessica Nickran, and I'm a program manager at the Child Neurology Foundation, where we support the 1 in 5 children experiencing neurologic conditions and their families. We know, too, that 90% of rare disorders have a neurologic component. So my question is, how will this accelerated pathway affect the childhood rare disease community? Thanks so much for your time.
Anyone want to tackle that one?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think for a rare disease, it's oftentimes really hard to do certain kinds of research. It can be hard or very slow to collect real-world evidence. Sometimes the biomarkers aren't identified. And so I think it's important that we're flexible in our approach and we focus on the clinical benefit that we can achieve for people who are living with these diseases. So if there is a clear case of clinical benefit, the accelerated pathway as it's written usually doesn't apply because there's no intermediate clinical endpoint or biomarker. And that makes it a challenge. But the FDA, I think, has shown, for example, in the ALS clinical trial guidance in 2019, that they're willing to be flexible because they recognize the severity of the illness and they're supposed to be taking into account all the treatment options that are available for people living with that disease. I think one of the key challenges that may be limiting their flexibility or their risk tolerance is that it's really hard to take a drug off the market if it turns out not to have an effect in the future. And so if the FDA had a simpler process to take a drug off the market, they might be more willing to approve a drug in the first place.
Cynthia, as far as Neil talked about bias and barriers and diversity. Diversity in clinical trials, diversity in helping patients who represent across the political spectrum as well as race. How are we doing there? Because that's not something that really has been in the lexicon until more recently in recent years, but now it's getting a lot of attention. How much progress are we making on that issue?
Well, it's a challenging circumstance for many people. So for people who have type 1 diabetes, they need to use insulin multiple times a day just to stay alive. And insulin is very expensive in the marketplace right now. And it means that someone with type 1 diabetes needs regular care from their doctor, and they need, insulin available to them, 24/7, and ideally, devices to help them. So it's especially challenging for people who don't have regular health care, who are underinsured or or uninsured. And so one of the reasons why JDRF has made insulin affordability such a top priority is to make sure that everyone, whether they have insurance or not, can afford the life-saving treatment that insulin is. Insulin, though, is not a cure, and people still have life with type 1 diabetes is still very challenging, even with insulin, and people have long-term and short-term very significant health outcomes. So that's why we're also focused on investing in research and working with the National Institutes of Health and Congress and the FDA and CMS and all the other acronyms to help move new research forward. And it's especially important that we make sure that as research moves forward, that everyone who wants to participate in clinical trials has access to that. So we have information on our website, both in terms of how to access programs to help people afford insulin and other therapies that they need, and also to participate in clinical trials, because we want everyone to benefit from what's currently available. But it's critical that as we move forward with clinical trials and move forward with the FDA, that we make sure that these therapies are reaching everyone, which is why we're spending so much time and energy on not only the research part of it, but the regulatory and the reimbursement pathways.
Jamie, just want to ask you a quick question. Got about 30 seconds left. Just on something at the federal or state level or community level that you've seen as kind of a good model for healthcare policymakers to mimic, some kind of good news that you think, hey, that program's working, maybe people should look at that program.
Well, tough question in 30 seconds, but I think the accelerated approval pathway is working as it intended. We have examples in the rare disease community of a rare lung disease where the treatment was approved on a biomarker of culture conversion, and it meant that patients got access to a therapy that was reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, meaning they would feel better, they would breathe better in the future, have fewer exacerbations, and it was done with the accelerated approval pathway. And why should we have made those patients wait to progress in an irreversible disease and a progressive disease? No, that pathway has worked many times and it can continue to work, but we have to avoid policies that are going to really stifle that potential moving forward. And so I would say I turn us right back to our topic today and say the accelerated approval pathway is working. That's not to say there aren't reforms that we can explore together that will really strengthen and protect the program moving forward.
Great points all around. I want to thank Cynthia Rice, Chief Mission Strategy Officer at JDRF, Neil Thacker, Chief Mission Officer at the ALS Association, and Jamie Sullivan, Senior Director for Policy at Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
My next guest lost his father to Alzheimer's, so this is a topic that he cares deeply about. Congressman Brian Higgins, a Democrat from New York, and the sponsor of the Comprehensive Care for Alzheimer's Act, joins me now. Congressman, thanks for joining us. I do want to start off, because this is so personal to you, can you tell our audience about the journey that you've had both personally and professionally to fight Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I lost my dad about 15 years ago to Alzheimer's, and it altered his whole persona. He was a gentleman. He was beloved by his friends and his family, and he took on a very different demeanor because of the Alzheimer's that had pervaded his brain. And I often say it's a disease whose origins are unknown, but its end is absolutely certain. And it ends in taking your cognitive ability, taking away your independence, and ultimately taking away your life. And we don't know enough about it. And, even the treatments that we're using today, they're the Aricept era drugs that were developed in the 1990s, and they're minimally effective in delaying the onset of Alzheimer's, but only for a short period of time. So we just need to do much better, and hence we created the Alzheimer's Caucus.
And you have legislation, as I mentioned, I was looking it up, 107 co-sponsors, 67 Democrats, 40 Republicans. co-sponsors range anywhere from Maxine Waters to Greg Pence. So this is, we live, as you know, in very polarizing times, but this legislation has attracted a lot of bipartisan support. Can you tell us a little bit about the bill and its prospects this Congress?
Well, the bill is simply designed to provide more research dollars to develop more effective means of dealing with a disease of the brain that is pervasive and growing. It costs the nation a lot of money. It's one of the leading causes of death for older people. And not enough is known about it to develop an effective therapy or drugs or vaccine to deal with it. You can only diagnose Alzheimer's in postmortem. And it's thought that there are these killer proteins called plaques and tangles. The plaques form around the nerve cell, causing the cell to die, and tangles form inside the neuron or the nerve cell. It interferes with the cellular machinery of the brain, which produces a protein that kills, the cell. So we have to find a way to deal with this. And, the region of the brain, the hippocampus, is where short-term memory is transferred to long-term memory. And it's thought that these killer proteins, plaques and tangles, accumulate in that region of the brain, which affects short-term and long-term memory.
You mentioned cost, and there's a high cost of Alzheimer's, obviously personally, but also you have a lot of government agencies wrestling with treatment. What is the 5 to 10 year outlook? And we have, as we have an aging population, Congressman, and we have a labor shortage, that's only going to get worse. I mean, these are big picture ideas. I mean, what can policymakers do, both in Congress and government agencies, to make sure that innovation happens, but also we have to be cognizant of Medicare, which was headed for bankruptcy?
Yeah, well, I think that treating Alzheimer's early with effective treatments is obviously the goal here. As I mentioned previously, the standard Aricept era drugs were developed in the 1990s. So obviously, there's not enough research dollars to develop effective treatments. Now, keep in mind, you've got the National Institutes of Health, which we fund every year, but you're competing with cancer treatments and research and the like. But it's obvious that we have not done a very good job as it relates to Alzheimer's because it's a disease of the aged in America. And up until the last couple of years, the life expectancy of people is much longer than it was historically. And as people live longer, they are more susceptible to these kinds of diseases like Alzheimer's. So research funding becomes critically important. And that's what this bill is intended to do, to give the National Institutes of Health the kind of resources that they need to do very, very aggressive research toward the goal of developing an effective therapeutic for Alzheimer's.
There are a lot of interested stakeholder groups, whether it's consumer groups or pharmaceutical companies, and you have government agencies regulating them, and that fine line of regulation, but also not inhibiting innovation. What do you think, and what have been the best practices of making progress on Alzheimer's that you could see the healthcare stakeholder groups? What's their role, and what can they do? Obviously, this affects Republicans and Democrats, as evidenced by your legislation that's supported by both parties. But the role of stakeholders, what do you think they can do over the next several years to actually get closer to better treatments and a cure?
Yeah, well, I think, if you look at the history of drug development and vaccine development, it's usually the federal government that's first in, that does the basic scientific research. And as, a promising new drug gets closer to the approval process, then the private sector takes over. They go into clinical trials to test both efficacy, effectiveness, and safety of all these drugs. So I think the advocates should be pushing Congress to approve more money for Alzheimer's, and the justification is all around us. It's a personal issue for many people, and they become, the family members. It's a disease that afflicts not only the person that has Alzheimer's, but those who love the afflicted. And those who love the afflicted become the greatest ambassadors, if you will, advocates for more governmental resources toward the goal of developing effective treatments.
You mentioned that this affects everybody, and African Americans and Latinos are included in that group disproportionately. So how can we ensure equity in clinical trials? That's a big issue right now.
It is a big issue, and I think the pandemic over the past 2 years and actually more exposed the fragility of the American economy and American society, and shows that there is a huge disparity in terms of health outcomes for communities of color. And we have to do a better job as it relates to that. So it's not only Alzheimer's, it's cancers, it's other chronic diseases that disproportionately affect communities of color. And it's true in Buffalo, it's true in Boston, it's true in Baton Rouge. And so these are trends that we have to embrace toward the goal of creating a more equitable distribution as it relates to healthcare services, including pharmaceuticals, drugs, and other therapies.
Congressman Higgins from New York, we really appreciate taking the time and sharing your personal and your legislation, which obviously has got some momentum right now. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And thank you to the Alzheimer's Association. They do great work here in Buffalo, but throughout the nation as well.
I am now joined by Congressman Neil Dunn, a Republican from Florida. He is a doctor and a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Welcome, Congressman. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. Appreciate it.
Let's start out. A lot to discuss on this topic and different agencies working on it. But big picture, where are we in the fight against Alzheimer's, and where do we need to go?
So there's actually a lot of promising news out there. There's probably 20 or 30 drugs that are working their way through the pipeline and are in either phase 3 or 2 trials. Some are still in phase 1. But honestly, there's a lot of promise out there. So I think something is going to come across the finish line soon. The first one to make it across is, of course, aducanumab, or it's sold under the name Aduhelm. So that was the first one, and it muddied the waters because it had a very abnormal approval process.
Right, very controversial. What do you think is the best way to approach it as far as both FDA and the approval process, as well as CMS, which is equally as important on the reimbursement side?
Yeah, so, traditionally everybody thinks if the FDA approves it, CMS is going to pay for it, cover it. And that's become the expectation. It's the CMS has in fact started sort of walking that back with a number of processes that they've instituted. They call them coverage with evidence, CEDs, evidence determination. So, but it's oftentimes they're using that for control of prices and costs rather than really evidence. However, I would say in this particular case, they have such an abnormal approval process through the FDA that it really looks like this is the problem that the CMS has is actually they have some doubts whether this drug should have been approved. And so they're kind of substituting their rules for what the FDA does. And that's really tough because CMS isn't designed to do that. They don't really have the wherewithal or expertise to run the trials and evaluate the trials the way the FDA does, even though one could argue the FDA dropped the ball this time.
As far as Aduhelm and other treatments down the line, you have to look at the fiscal situation of Medicare, and of course Alzheimer's is so expensive without a cure. But how do policymakers have to really balance both cost and approval and making sure people get the care they need, but it's also worthy of government dollars, especially when you have the nation's debt limit at its highest ever?
So I think you separate those functions. You've got FDA saying, is it efficacious? Is it safe? And then, you've got CMS that comes along and says, this price is acceptable or it's not to society at large. And you will notice that actually the company that makes this drug, Biogen, actually cut the price in half because of the controversy, the public outcry, if you will, after it was introduced. Still a very expensive drug, but as you mentioned, Alzheimer's is expensive, untreated too, very expensive. So there's a lot of balancing there. I would say that you don't want FDA to be thinking about price. You don't want CMS thinking about, is the drug any darn good? You'd like to know, before the CMS gets involved, you want them to know that they've got a drug that's safe and efficacious, or if it's only borderline, how borderline it is. And by conflating those two responsibilities, I think we've really what we've lost here is public confidence. And, public confidence in federal health authorities is already at a record low all time. And when we have fumbles like this, we lower their confidence even further. And, that's a lot of damage to be done to public confidence.
I really enjoy talking to doctors who serve in Congress to get their perspective on what does Washington not get that real doctors like you come to Washington and say, you've got to understand this. It could be a couple things, but what have you seen as a disconnect?
So one of the most common lectures I give to young doctors when I go on grand rounds and whatnot now still is to say, listen, when you go to that patient's bedside, you're there to help that patient. You're not there to practice public policy. If you want to practice public policy, you come to Washington or go to your state capital, but do not practice public policy at the bedside. That's not your job there. You're supposed to save that patient. And so it really is a very big disconnect from being a doctor where, I want to save every patient I come across. But you come up here and you say, I want to save every patient I come across. And I've only got, several $100 billion to do it. And there's a lot of patients. So that's a different trade-off. And that's one that we have to understand as a society, but it's not one that should be done at the bedside.
What's the role of stakeholders here? I mean, everybody wants a cure, better treatments that are affordable. Those are all difficult things. Everybody wants to spur innovation, but also regulate it so it's safe. Yeah, how can the stakeholders and really Democrats and Republicans who have, in your committee, have competing legislation and kind of tackling this issue, how can kind of people get to the goal and keep the partisan politics aside?
So I think let's start with counting the stakeholders, because we think there's a lot of Alzheimer's patients, and there are. But this amyloid deposits, amyloid plaque deposits on neurons in the brain actually characterize a number of common ailments. Down syndrome jumps to mind. Traumatic brain injury jumps to mind. Even PTSD has been implicated with amyloid plaque deposition. So you have a huge population of patients, families, veterans who are desperate to get to these drugs. And they had been trained over the years to believe that if the FDA approves a drug, it's safe, it's efficacious, and that CMS would cover it. And now we find that CMS isn't going to cover very much of it at the front end, at least. And we also have reason to doubt both the efficacy and the safety profile of this drug. So we are really in a little bit of untraveled waters.
And speaking of those waters, we're in a COVID time. We're not doing events yet back in person. Certainly, what have we learned? We've learned a lot from the COVID-19 times. What have we learned as far as it relates to Alzheimer's and innovation? We have vaccines that were made in record time historically, and obviously it hasn't been a panacea, but it certainly helped.
So you're right. So, I mean, that Operation Warp Speed, where they took the approval process, instead of it was a silo, you had to go through this hoop, this hoop, this hoop, this hoop. But instead of doing them sequentially, you could do them all simultaneously. It makes sense. It's an expensive way to do it. But we had to do that during that pandemic. I would say we did some really good things with that kind of deregulation. It's not deregulation. It's just streamlining the regulation. But we also missed some things. And so that's really where I'd like to see NIH, FDA, CDC get together and say, okay, we can do this, but we can do it better. We can make better choices, because we dropped the ball on the choices of therapeutics, and we dropped the ball on some of the choices of diagnostics and even surveillance programs for SARS-CoV-2 and the next pandemic, whatever that was going to be. So, and we could learn from our mistakes. Unfortunately, by mandating a lot of things, and we've known this forever, this isn't a surprise. When you mandate vaccines, when you mandate almost anything in health, you get an inversion of uptake. That means the public believes you less, they trust you less when you tell them they have to do it. Much better to convince them that it's the right thing to do. And we've known that forever. You can't find a textbook that says make a mandate. It doesn't happen.
Congressman, Doctor, really appreciate your thoughts. Enjoyed the conversation today.
Anytime, Bob. Thanks so much.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to the Alzheimer's Association for its support and to all of you attendees for joining us for this discussion. For those of you who may have missed any of the conversations, video from the event will be up on our website shortly. I'm Bob Cusack. Have a great day.